You can't argue with reality, but these women tried. I'm Tucker, and today we're tracking down the Karens who thought their egos could rewrite the world record books. From a woman who stepped onto a high line thousands of feet up on one of the windiest days of the year, to a scuba diver who plunged deeper than almost anyone has ever dared to go. It was September 16th, 2017, at a mountain overlook in northern Arizona. For most visitors, it was a place to take photographs. For one woman, it was the stage for a world record attempt. Angela Asay, a 46-year-old office administrator from Phoenix. She had recently become fascinated with world record attempts. She spent hours watching videos of people performing unusual challenges and gaining attention online. Over time, she became convinced that accomplishing a record herself could bring her the recognition she wanted. After researching different possibilities, Angela settled on an unofficial plate balancing endurance challenge. Unlike records that required years of training or expensive equipment, this one seemed achievable. She felt especially confident because she had briefly worked as a waitress in her younger years and remembered becoming comfortable carrying stacks of plates during busy restaurant shifts. For several months, Angela practiced balancing increasingly larger stacks of dinner plates. She imagined recording a successful attempt and sharing it online. Instead of attempting the challenge indoors, she chose a scenic mountain overlook that sat approximately 4,735 feet above sea level and offered a dramatic view of the desert valley below. She believed the location would make the footage more impressive. On the morning of the attempt, Angela arrived wearing a bright neon pink tracksuit. Her 17-year-old son, Tyrone, accompanied her and filmed with a handheld camera. Several hikers and sightseers nearby stopped to watch. Conditions were not ideal. The overlook was exposed, and occasional gusts of wind swept across the rocky terrain. One bystander noticed Angela standing dangerously close to the edge of the cliff and suggested she move farther back. Angela immediately argued with him. She insisted she knew what she was doing and snapped that the camera angle was perfect where she was. When the bystander mentioned the wind, Angela laughed it off, saying the challenge was easier than people thought before continuing her preparations. The warning was about the cliff edge, but her response was about the frame. The timer started, and Angela lifted the stack into position. For several minutes, she balanced the stack successfully. She appeared calm and confident as Tyrone recorded. As time passed, the wind strengthened. The plates began to sway slightly, which another bystander warned her, but she dismissed. Moments later, a stronger gust struck the stack. One of the upper plates shifted noticeably out of alignment. Instinctively, Angela lunged sideways to stabilize the stack before it could topple. In doing so, she stepped onto a patch of loose gravel near the cliff edge. Her foot slid unexpectedly. Angela attempted to regain her balance, but she was still reacting to the shifting plates. As she stumbled, her momentum carried her backward toward the edge. Witnesses reported seeing her make a final effort to stop herself, but the unstable footing left little opportunity to recover. She lost her balance and went over the cliff edge. Emergency responders were called immediately, but Angela suffered fatal traumatic injuries from the fall. Investigators later found no evidence of foul play, equipment failure, or criminal conduct. The incident was ruled an accidental fall. The investigation concluded that the primary contributing factors were Angela's decision to perform the challenge near the cliff edge, the gusting wind conditions, the loose gravel, and her choice to continue despite warnings from bystanders. No record was recognized, and the footage remained largely unknown outside her family and local community. What began as an attempt to gain recognition ended as a tragedy caused by a series of avoidable decisions and environmental hazards. The next story follows a woman who ignored warnings while chasing a local record inside her Ohio restaurant. It was on the 7th of August, 2018, in a small township in Ohio. A middle-aged chef was doing something that was drawing a crowd, something that would make her famous in her town, just not in the way she had hoped. Stephanie Rosie Clark, 48 years old, was a trained chef with years of experience. She believed her talent deserved far more recognition than she had received. She had recently opened a restaurant on the edge of town, but business had been slower than expected, and she was becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of attention. Stephanie was known for rejecting advice. Employees found it difficult to suggest improvements because she rarely accepted criticism, and friends described her as stubborn and convinced she knew better than everyone around her. When residents suggested advertising campaigns or community events to attract customers, she dismissed the ideas. She wanted something larger and more memorable. That opportunity came when she learned about a local endurance cooking benchmark. 5 years earlier, another chef had completed a supervised cooking marathon lasting 72 hours. Though unofficial outside the town, the achievement had become a well-known point of local pride. Stephanie announced she would break it. I recognize the frustration underneath that stubbornness. A talented person watching something they built fail to get the attention it deserves is a genuinely difficult thing. I understand why the record felt like a solution. The event was held inside her restaurant. Local reporters covered the attempt, residents stopped by throughout the day, and customers filled the dining area to watch. The publicity worked exactly as she had hoped, with her restaurant's name spreading rapidly across community social media pages as the challenge continued. Stephanie loved the attention. Reporters interviewed her throughout the challenge, videos spread online, and the growing crowd only reinforced her belief that the record would be worth it. But there was a problem. Staff had noticed occasional movement from the heavy light fixture above the main cooking station and raised concerns about its condition. A maintenance inspection had already been scheduled for the following week, but Stephanie refused to relocate the cooking station. It sat directly in front of the cameras, and she wanted the entire challenge to remain visible to the crowd. Several employees mentioned the fixture throughout the event after noticing occasional movement and signs of wear. Stephanie dismissed the concerns, insisting it had been hanging there for years and that moving the cooking station would ruin the presentation. The cooking continued. Visitors came and went, kids took photos, and by the third day, nearly the whole town was watching. Then, after 73 hours and 12 minutes, Stephanie broke the record. The crowd cheered and clapped. Reporters rushed forward. Stephanie stood right at the center of it all, smiling. Stephanie announced that she would prepare a special celebratory dish beneath the demonstration station where she had spent most of the event. She moved back beneath the wobbling light fixture to prepare a final dish. The crowd leaned in closer to watch. Then, suddenly, the bracket holding the fixture gave way. The heavy light crashed down and struck Stephanie directly on the head. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported her to a regional trauma center. Doctors diagnosed multiple skull fractures and a severe traumatic brain injury caused by blunt force impact. Despite emergency surgery, the damage proved irreversible. She died later that evening. Investigators later determined that the fixture's mounting assembly had been deteriorating for an extended period. While employees had reported concerns about occasional movement, the full extent of the structural weakness was not understood until after the collapse. Investigators concluded that relocating the cooking station or addressing the maintenance concerns before the event would likely have prevented the accident. Stephanie obtained the record she had wanted. It was also the final achievement of her life. The next story takes place in the sky above Kansas, where a woman exited an aircraft at 17,000 feet and, in the first seconds of free fall, made one movement she had been specifically asked not to make. It was on the 18th of September, 2015. Outside Topeka, Kansas, a civilian drop zone was hosting a special high-altitude jump event when a record attempt ended in tragedy. Kimberly Bennett was 53 years old, a property manager from Missouri. Friends described her as determined, argumentative, and intensely competitive. Former coworkers often joked that Kimberly treated disagreements as contests she refused to lose. She brought that same mindset into skydiving. Over 3 years, Kimberly had accumulated just over 108 jumps. While experienced enough to be comfortable in freefall, she was still far from the level of jumpers who routinely performed advanced aerial maneuvers. In the months leading up to the accident, Kimberly became focused on a local milestone. Months earlier, another woman had completed a civilian jump from approximately 16,500 feet, the highest altitude jump by a female skydiver in the drop zone's history. The achievement carried no official recognition, but among regular jumpers it remained well known. The planned jump was straightforward. The aircraft would climb to roughly 17,000 feet, requiring supplemental oxygen during the ascent. After exit, Kimberly was expected to perform a standard skydive and land normally. Several instructors voiced concerns not about the altitude itself, but about Kimberly's tendency to overcorrect body position during freefall. Video from previous jumps showed minor instability she usually recovered from, but experienced jumpers worried that excitement and pressure could magnify those mistakes. Kimberly disagreed, insisting she had more than enough experience. She eventually agreed to keep things simple, maintain a stable exit, stay altitude aware, and avoid unnecessary maneuvers. The aircraft climbed to altitude with oxygen protocols active, and witnesses on board described Kimberly as visibly agitated, still carrying the heat of the earlier argument, and at 10:40 in the morning, she exited the aircraft. By the time she stepped out of that aircraft, I am not sure the agreement was the thing driving her anymore. At first, Kimberly was falling smoothly and steadily through the air, but then she decided to spin her body, even though her instructors had told her not to. The spin started small, but it kept getting faster and faster. Every attempt to stop it only seemed to make it worse. As the seconds passed, Kimberly became increasingly disoriented and lost awareness of how much altitude she was burning through while fighting for control. By the time Kimberly initiated deployment, she had already spent far too much altitude trying to recover from the spin. Because her body was still rotating, the parachute opened with severe line twists and entered an unstable descent. Under normal circumstances, the malfunction was recoverable, but Kimberly had deployed too low. She simply ran out of altitude before corrective action could be completed. She impacted an open field beside the drop zone and was transported to a regional trauma center. Despite emergency surgery, she died later that evening from severe traumatic injuries sustained during the impact. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries resulting from a high-speed parachuting accident. Investigators found no evidence of equipment failure. The accident was attributed to loss of control during freefall, resulting in a compromised parachute deployment and insufficient altitude for recovery. No criminal charges were filed, and the drop zone continued operating after the investigation concluded. The altitude milestone Kimberly had hoped to surpass was never formally recognized, and the attempt became known within the local skydiving community as a cautionary example of how quickly a manageable situation can become unrecoverable. While Kimberly spent her altitude trying to recover from a mistake she had promised not to make, the next story follows a woman who ignored repeated warnings about her motorcycle before pushing it to extreme speeds. It was September 10th, 2016. In a county on the south of Nebraska, a small group of motorcycle riders gathered on a privately owned agricultural access road outside town they had rented for the afternoon, far from traffic, an informal but carefully organized private gathering. Michelle Megan Carter was 47 years old, an office administrator from Grand Island who had been riding with the group long enough to know its rhythms and long enough to have earned a reputation. Riders described her as persistent to the point of inflexibility, frequently questioning instructions and resisting limits she felt were unnecessary. Over time, this created friction, particularly around safety discussions and equipment recommendations. The group had an informal tradition called benchmark runs, held on a 1.4-mile straight stretch of road where riders would accelerate hard and compare their best speeds. There were no official records and no trophies, just the satisfaction of knowing your number against everyone else's. And over time, Michelle had quietly decided she wanted hers to be the fastest. In the days leading up to the September session, experienced riders in the group raised concerns about her motorcycle, a modified Suzuki Hayabusa. But the rear tire was several years old and approaching the end of its recommended high-speed service life, slightly worn steering head bearings, the suspension tuning, and how the chassis would behave in crosswind, but Michelle heard the feedback and did not change her plan. On the day itself, she declined a recommended tire swap, declined additional practice runs, and requested a later afternoon time slot, despite warnings about the gusting crosswind, which measured around 20 to 30 miles per hour across open farmland as the day wore on. And one mechanic in the group, uncomfortable enough with the setup, quietly stepped back from the final preparation work altogether. I find it disturbing that a mechanic looked at the setup and decided he did not want their hands on it. That is a very clear signal, and Michelle rode past it. Marshals were positioned at both ends of the road, radios were open between observers, and a defined braking zone sat beyond the timed section, and when Michelle's turn came, she was last to run, visibly tense during the final checks, receiving one last reminder about tire loading before she pulled away. The early phase of the run looked stable, the motorcycle building speed cleanly passed the benchmarks left by every other rider that day, but as she pushed towards 190 miles per hour, a small lateral drift began, and the corrections she fed into the handlebars introduced a front-end oscillation that the chassis, already working at the edge of its tuning, could not absorb. A minor ripple in the road surface was enough to tip the wobble beyond recovery, and when she applied the brakes, the weight transfer removed the last margin the bike had left, and the motorcycle left the road and dropped into a roadside ditch. Michelle was separated from the bike on impact, and the standby crew that reached her found she had suffered catastrophic, multiple trauma injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as multiple traumatic injuries sustained in a high-speed motorcycle crash. Investigators found no single mechanical defect responsible for the crash. The accident was attributed to a combination of crosswinds, worn motorcycle components, road conditions, and loss of control at extreme speed. Following the crash, the group discontinued its benchmark runs, and Michelle never achieved the speed record she had been pursuing. Michelle attempted to surpass speed limit on land, and the next Karen went underwater off the coast of Egypt, trying to surpass the depth limits of the sea. It was July 25th, 2017. Off the coast of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, a diver descended into one of the Red Sea's most demanding reef walls and never fully returned to the person she was before she went under. Chioma Ibe, a 43-year-old Nigerian, arrived in Sharm el-Sheikh after working in commercial diving roles abroad. She was experienced and confident, but colleagues noted she often dismissed conservative dive planning and safety necessities. In this environment, a specific section of reef wall had become an informal reference point among experienced divers. It was not a record or competition, but a commonly used drop-off point along the wall used for deep training profiles and personal limits, particularly in mixed gas dives requiring trimix and staged decompression discipline. When she learned about the wall's informal depth limit and the history of a previous fatal incident linked to a failed ascent, no direct indication of concern was recorded during briefing. Local divers explained that past accidents were rarely caused by depth alone, but by cascading factors such as extended bottom time, delayed gas switches, and deviations in ascent rate under task loading. On the day of the dive, conditions were calm, with clear visibility and stable surface seas. Support divers were staged at planned decompression depths to assist with gas logistics and emergency response if required. Chioma descended on a trimix configuration, following the wall steadily into depth. Early descent checks were stable, and she reached the planned maximum zone without issue. However, in a bid to surpass the previous diving depth record, she continued slightly beyond the agreed limit, extending both bottom time and depth exposure beyond the profile briefed to the team. This additional exposure increased inert gas loading beyond what her decompression schedule could safely accommodate within its planned gradients, and that deviation placed her outside the planned decompression envelope. Her ascent in Italy followed protocol, with staged decompression stops and planned gas switches. However, observers noted subtle deviations, including shortened stop durations and delayed gas switching. Later commentary suggested it was likely influenced by workload management and increasing physiological stress at depth. I find that the most important pattern in technical diving accidents is the way each small departure from the plan makes the next one slightly more likely, until the profile has drifted somewhere the body cannot follow safely. By mid-ascent, the profile had diverged from the intended decompression curve. At shallower stops, she appeared slower to respond to hand signals, and support divers observed increasing instability in her buoyancy control. Eventually, she began ascending faster than planned, skipping or abbreviating final decompression obligations. Within minutes of surfacing, she exhibited acute neurological symptoms consistent with severe decompression illness. She was assisted onto the dive boat by support divers, where emergency oxygen was administered immediately. Sharm el-Sheikh has recompression capability, but delays in stabilizing and transporting her reduced treatment effectiveness. Chioma died later that day. In the aftermath, local divers reviewed the incident, emphasizing that accidents in technical diving rarely result from a single decision, but from cumulative deviations across planning, execution, and ascent discipline. The reef wall remained unchanged, but discussions in the community shifted towards stricter adherence to dive profiles, gas management discipline, and reduced emphasis on informal depth benchmarks. Chioma descended past her agreed limit and the decompression stopped working in her favor. Similar to our next case, where a runner set out to break an informal record and the weather started working against her. It happened on 14th of August, 2019, in a small town north of Portsmouth during the town's annual summer marathon, an event primarily known for local participation rather than competitive elite racing. And that year, an unusual late summer heat wave had settled over the region. Patricia Marie Walker was a 41-year-old college teacher and a recreational runner from a nearby county. Within her local running club, Walker was known as a persistent and outspoken participant who frequently challenged pacing suggestions and race day instructions. Club members described repeated disagreements over safety briefings and hydration guidance, particularly during longer summer events. She had recently expressed interest in improving her personal best on the Portsmouth course. In the weeks before the marathon, she became focused on the course record for amateur female runners, an informal benchmark set under significantly cooler race conditions several years earlier. Experienced runners and one club coach advised against attempting a record pace given the forecasted heat. They noted that conditions on race day were likely to exceed safe endurance thresholds for sustained high-intensity effort, particularly in the second half of the course when dehydration and glycogen depletion typically compound physiological strain. Walker declined to adjust her plan, stating she intended to run by effort rather than conditions and would reassess during the race if necessary. The course ran a familiar loop: the town center, an exposed waterfront stretch, and a shaded light return segment. By mid-morning, temperatures sat in the low to mid 86 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity pushing the heat index into what officials classified as elevated risk. Organizers issued pacing advisories, added hydration stations, misting points, and briefed medical teams accordingly. Walker started at a pace targeting the course record. Through the early stages, she held steady form, but entering the exposed waterfront section, her stride shortened and arm swing dropped, early markers of thermal strain. At a hydration station, she took fluids but declined active cooling. By the 11-mile mark, she was clearly struggling, her steps uneven and wobbly, and medical staff were already moving along the course to keep a close eye on her. Shortly after the 18-mile point, she collapsed on an exposed section of roadway. On-site medical personnel initiated immediate cooling measures, including ice application and active external cooling, and arranged urgent transfer to the hospital. She arrived with exertional heat stroke, marked hyperthermia, and altered neurological status. Despite active cooling, intravenous fluids, and critical care, her condition deteriorated. Complications included rhabdomyolysis, acute kidney injury, and electrolyte imbalance contributing to cardiac instability. She was pronounced dead later that day. A post-event review cited extreme environmental conditions as a significant contributing factor, alongside competitive pacing choices as a major risk variable. Several other participants required heat-related treatment. Organizers subsequently updated protocols, introducing stricter guidance on event modification during high heat index conditions and clearer in-race pacing advisories. Patricia collapsed at chasing a record that the weather had made unreachable before she even started. The next woman climbed a tower 6 times in a single morning against all forms of warning. It was on the 3rd of August, 2016, at a tourist tower in Ontario. The stairwell was alive with the sound of footsteps, and somewhere in that crowd of climbers, a woman from Ohio was about to push herself past a line she could not see. Denise Atwater was a 56-year-old retired insurance administrator from suburban Ohio. Friends described her as determined and highly competitive and famously argumentative, opinionated, regularly challenging supervisors, organizers, and staff whenever she felt dismissed or treated unfairly, often escalating conflicts with authority figures. Over the years, she had participated in numerous charity walks and stair climbing fundraisers, often supporting cardiovascular research after her husband survived a heart attack. While vacationing in Ontario, Denise learned of a charity stair climbing event being held at a tourist tower. Having completed similar events before, she set herself an ambitious personal goal: to complete more ascents than she could find documented from previous participants. The event required participants to climb the tower's 1,707th six-step stairway under staff supervision before returning to the ground by elevator. Denise began climbing shortly after the event opened. Throughout the morning, Denise completed multiple ascents at a relentless pace, skipping recommended recovery breaks. By early afternoon, she had completed 6 full climbs, far more than most participants. Signs of strain emerged quickly. Witnesses described her as flushed, drenched drenched in sweat and breathing heavily. Medical volunteers approached her twice, urging her to stop and hydrate. Though visibly exhausted, she remained coherent and declined both times, insisting she was close to her goal. Event staff and security personnel also expressed concern as her condition worsened. After a brief evaluation, she was strongly advised not to continue, but because she remained alert and denied severe symptoms, staff allowed her to proceed. Other climbers later reported that during the ascent, Denise appeared unsteady and was no longer climbing at a consistent pace, often remaining stationary on landings for extended periods before continuing. At some point, she slowed dramatically, stopping frequently, leaning on the handrail, and appearing pale. Fellow climbers asked if she was all right. On a landing, she gripped the railing, appeared momentarily confused, complained of chest pressure, and attempted to push upward. Staff members moving behind her noticed and immediately began approaching. Before they could reach her, Denise stumbled as she collapsed and struck a metal support structure on the landing. The impact sent her tumbling down several steps where she came to rest against the railing. Emergency crews arrived quickly and began treating her right away. She was rushed to a nearby hospital in critical condition. Despite every effort to save her, Denise passed away that evening. Event organizers later confirmed that she had completed more ascents than any previously documented participant before the collapse. The medical examiner concluded that the primary event was a sudden loss of consciousness during exertion, but the immediate cause of death was determined to be complications from traumatic injuries sustained in the fall, compounded by the physical stress of prolonged exertion. Investigators found no wrongdoing. The death was ruled accidental. Following the tragedy, organizers changed their safety rules, adding more space between climbers and support structures along the route. If you like this video, go ahead and smash that like button, and what the heck, go ahead and subscribe. You know you want to. We'll see you next time.